in the furthest reaches of known space, where ancient predators rule through terror and entire civilizations kneel in submission. A 7-year-old human girl named Maya will do something that has never been done in 10,000 years of galactic history. She will show kindness to a creature that every species fears. What happens next will reshape the understanding of humanity across 100 worlds and prove that sometimes the smallest acts of courage can topple empires built on fear. The morning sky over Zalani Prime burned crimson as massive shadows blotted out the twin suns. Ambassador Sarah Chen pressed her face against the viewport of the human diplomatic vessel, watching in horror as dozens of sleek obsidian ships descended through the atmosphere like falling stars of doom. Each vessel stretched nearly 2 kilometers in length, their hulls rippling with an organic quality that made them appear more grown than built. "The Draconian Empire," whispered her aide, Marcus Webb, his voice barely audible over the hum of their ship's engines. We're too late. Sarah's hands clenched into fists as she watched the alien warships take position above the peaceful settlements below. The Zalani had been humanity's first true allies in the sector of space, gentle, philosophical beings who had welcomed human traders and diplomats with open arms just 3 years ago. Now their world was about to become another trophy in the Draconian Empire's endless expansion. "Mom, what are those big ships doing?" asked Maya, Sarah's 7-year-old daughter, pressing her small face against the viewport beside her mother. The child's bright green eyes reflected the crimson glow from outside, filled with curiosity rather than the fear that gripped every adult on the bridge. Sarah knelt beside her daughter, struggling to find words that wouldn't terrify the child. Maya had insisted on coming on this diplomatic mission, arguing with the stubborn determination that only children possessed, that she wanted to see the pretty crystal people again. The Zalani, with their translucent skin and gentle manner, had fascinated Maya during their first meeting. "They're visitors, sweetheart," Sarah said carefully, "but not the kind we want to see." Captain Rodriguez, the grizzled pilot of their diplomatic vessel, turned from his controls with grim expression. "Ambassador, we need to leave now. My sensors are picking up massive energy signatures from those ships. Whatever they're planning, it's going to happen soon." Through the viewport, they could see the Zalani cities spread across the planet's surface like glittering jewels. The crystal spires that housed millions of peaceful beings reflected the morning light in rainbow patterns that had taken Maya's breath away during their previous visit. Those same towers were now casting long shadows as the draconian ships positioned themselves overhead. "We can't just leave them," Sarah said, though she knew their small diplomatic vessel stood no chance against the armada above. "There has to be something." Her words were cut short as the first draconian ship began to descend toward the planet's surface. As it broke through the lower atmosphere, the vessel's true nature became horrifyingly apparent. It wasn't just a ship, it was alive. The obsidian hull rippled and shifted, revealing itself to be scales of impossible size. Wings unfurled from the vessel's sides, each one spanning hundreds of meters and blotting out entire city districts below. What they had mistaken for a spacecraft was actually a dragon of mythical proportions, its eyes glowing like molten gold as it surveyed the world beneath it. "By all the saints," Captain Rodriguez breathed, "those aren't ships. They're actual dragons." More of the creatures revealed themselves, transforming from vessels into living nightmares that had terrorized 1,000 worlds. The smallest among them was still large enough to dwarf the largest human battleships, while the eldest stretched across the sky like living mountains. Their scales gleamed with an inner fire, and when they roared, the sound echoed across continents. Maya gasped in wonder rather than fear, her small hands pressed against the viewport. "They're beautiful," she whispered. The adults on the bridge exchanged worried glances. Only a child could see beauty in creatures that had brought terror to half the galaxy. The Draconian Empire was legendary for its cruelty. They didn't just conquer worlds, they fed on the fear of their victims, growing stronger with each civilization they destroyed. And below them, the Zalani cities erupted in panic. The crystal beings fled through their streets in waves of shimmering terror, their translucent forms flickering with distress patterns that painted the cities in chaotic light. But there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide from predators that could see across continents and smell fear from orbit. The largest dragon, a creature so massive its wings created their own weather systems, descended toward the capital city. As it approached the surface, its form began to shift and contract, scales flowing like liquid metal until it stood on the ground in a more compact form, though still towering over the tallest buildings like a living skyscraper. Sarah recognized the ritual from intelligence reports. The Draconians would select representatives from the local population, usually leaders or warriors, and challenge them to single combat. Not to test their strength, the outcome was never in doubt, but to break the spirit of entire civilizations by demonstrating their helplessness against superior force. They're going to make examples of the Zilani leaders, Marcus said quietly, reading the same intelligence briefings in his mind. Force the population to watch their strongest individuals fall, then demand total surrender. Through their ship's communication array, they could hear the panic transmissions from the surface. The Zilani Council was trying to evacuate their children, but the dragons had already surrounded the major cities. There would be no escape, no last-minute rescue. The gentle crystal people would join the list of civilizations that existed only as footnotes in draconian history. Mom, Maya tugged at Sarah's sleeve. Why are the pretty people scared of the dragons? They're not doing anything mean yet. Sarah looked down at her daughter, amazed by the child's innocence. Maya had been born on a frontier world where humans had learned to coexist with creatures that other species found terrifying. To her, dragons were just very large animals, no more inherently evil than the massive predator birds that nested near their home colony. The dragons have hurt people before, sweetheart. The Zilani are afraid because they remember the stories. But maybe these dragons don't want to hurt anyone, Maya said with the simple logic that only children possessed. Maybe they just look scary, but they're really nice inside. If only it were that simple, Sarah thought. But the Draconian Empire had built its reputation over millennia. They were conquerors and destroyers, creatures that viewed other species as either food or entertainment. Their very presence in a system meant death for millions and slavery for the survivors. On the planet below, the great dragon had reached the central plaza of the capital city. Hundreds of thousands of Zilani had gathered there, not by choice but herded together by smaller dragons that circled overhead like shepherds managing a flock. The crowd's terror was visible even from orbit. Waves of distressed light patterns rippling through the crystal beings like a sea of liquid fear. The massive dragon reared back on its hind legs, spreading wings that cast the entire plaza in shadow. When it spoke, its voice carried across the planet with the force of an earthquake, translated into 100 languages by the fear responses it triggered in every sentient mind. I am Vorthak the Render, first talent of the Draconian Empire, keeper of the fire that burns worlds. You are the Zilani and you will kneel. The plaza full of crystal beings immediately dropped to their knees, their forms flickering with submission patterns that painted the ground in pale blue light. But kneeling wasn't enough for the ritual. One of them would have to stand, would have to face the dragon in combat so that their inevitable defeat could be witnessed by all. Choose your champion, Vorthak rumbled, his golden eyes scanning the crowd like a predator selecting prey. Let them come forward to face judgment, that all may see the price of resistance. For long moments, no one moved. The Zilani were not warriors. They were philosophers, artists, scientists who had never known violence before the galaxy's expansion brought them into contact with predatory species. They had no champions, no heroes trained for battle. They had only their courage, and even that was failing them. Finally, an elderly Zilani rose to his feet. They recognized him from their diplomatic meetings. Elder Crystallis, the head of their council. His crystal form was clouded with age and fear, but he walked forward with as much dignity as he could manage. I will stand for my people, Crystallis said, his voice amplified by the dragon's technology so all could hear. Though I know I cannot prevail, I will not let others bear this burden. Perfect lowered his great head to study the elderly crystal being, amusement flickering in his molten eyes. Brave words from prey, but bravery without strength is merely a louder way to die. Protocol scales glowing brighter as internal fires built toward release. This was how it always ended. A display of overwhelming force that would leave nothing but ash where the challenger had stood, breaking the spirit of all who watched. No, Maya said suddenly, her small voice clear in the silence of the ship's bridge. He doesn't have to do that. Before anyone could react, Before any of the adults could process what the child was planning, Maya had activated the emergency airlock. Alarms blared throughout the ship as the 7-year-old girl stepped into the transport pod and launched herself toward the planet's surface. "Maya!" Sarah screamed, lunging toward the controls, but it was too late. The pod was already streaking toward the surface, carrying the most precious thing in her universe directly into the jaws of destruction. Captain Rodriguez was already changing course, diving their ship toward the planet in a desperate attempt to intercept the pod, but they both knew it was hopeless. The child would reach the surface long before they could catch up, and once she was on the ground with the dragons, there would be nothing any of them could do to save her. On the surface, the great dragon Vorthak had noticed the approaching pod. His massive head turned upward, golden eyes tracking the small vessel as it descended toward the plaza. Around him, the gathered Zalani pressed closer together, their fear patterns intensifying as they wondered what new horror was about to be visited upon them. The transport pod landed with a soft thump in the center of the plaza, just a few meters from where Elder Crystallis stood facing the enormous dragon. The pod's door hissed open, and Maya Chen, 7 years old and barely tall enough to reach an adult's waist, stepped out onto the crystal pavement. She looked up at Vorthak without a trace of fear, her green eyes bright with curiosity. The dragon stared down at her, confusion replacing the cruel amusement in his gaze. In 10,000 years of conquest, nothing like this had ever happened. A human child, alone and unafraid, standing in the shadow of his wings. "Hello," Maya said politely, her clear voice carrying in the sudden silence. "You're even more beautiful up close." Vorthak blinked, his great head tilting slightly as he tried to process what he was seeing. Around the plaza, dragons and Zalani alike stared in stunned silence at the tiny human who had just called the most feared predator in the galaxy beautiful. "You are a youngling," Vorthak said finally, his voice dropping to a rumble that was merely thunderous rather than earthquake loud. "Where are your guardians, small human?" Maya pointed up at the sky where her mother's ship was now diving toward the surface. "My mom's up there, she's really worried about me, but I had to come down here." Why? The question seemed to surprise the dragon as much as everyone else. Vorthak had never asked prey to explain themselves before. Maya looked around the plaza, taking in the terrified Zalani, the circle of smaller dragons, and finally returning her gaze to the massive creature looming over her. "'Cause you look sad," she said simply. "Under all the scary parts, you look really, really sad. And I don't think anyone should have to be sad alone." The words hit Vorthak like a physical blow. His great head jerked back, golden eyes widening with something that might have been shock, might have been pain, might have been recognition of a truth he had tried to bury for millennia. Around the plaza, the silence deepened. Dragons who had terrorized worlds found themselves holding their breath, waiting to see how their greatest warrior would respond to the observation of a human child. The Zalani, their terror patterns fading to confusion, watched as their would-be destroyer struggled with emotions they had never seen in a draconian before. High above, Sarah's ship broke through the atmosphere, racing toward the surface at dangerous speed. But even as she watched her daughter standing fearlessly before the dragon, Sarah realized that something unprecedented was happening. For the first time in recorded history, a draconian conquest had stopped, not because of resistance, not because of superior force, but because a child had seen past the monster to the being beneath. Maya took a step closer to the massive dragon, her small hand extended as if she wanted to pet a very large dog. "It's okay to be sad sometimes," she said gently, "but you don't have to hurt people to make it stop hurting. That never really works anyway." Vorthak stared down at the tiny hand reaching toward him, at the complete absence of fear in the child's eyes, at the simple compassion that no warrior in 1,000 campaigns had ever offered him. Something deep in his ancient heart, something he had thought dead for millennia, began to stir. The fate of 2 civilizations, the future of an empire, and the course of galactic history now hung on what the dragon would do next. And for the first time in his long life, Vorthak the Render, first talent of the Draconian Empire, had absolutely no idea what that should be. Vorthak's massive form trembled as he stared down at the small human child. In all his centuries of existence, no being had ever dared to approach him with kindness. Fear, hatred, desperate bargaining, these he understood. But compassion from someone he had come to destroy was beyond his comprehension. "You should be afraid," he rumbled, his voice uncertain for the first time in millennia. "I have burned worlds. I have silenced the songs of 100 civilizations. Your species should know this." Maya tilted her head, studying the great dragon with the same intense focus she gave to interesting insects back home. "But you don't want to burn things anymore, do you? I can see it in your eyes. They're not mean eyes. They're tired eyes." The other dragons in the plaza shifted restlessly, their own confusion growing as they watched their leader's unprecedented hesitation. Scareth the Bold, a younger dragon whose crimson scales marked him as one of Vorthak's most aggressive lieutenants, spread his wings in agitation. "Great Vorthak," Scareth called out, his voice carrying the edge of challenge that younger dragons used when testing their superiors. "The prey speaks strangely. Perhaps it seeks to cast some human enchantment upon you." But Vorthak paid no attention to his lieutenant's words. His golden eyes remained fixed on Maya, seeing something in her earnest expression that he couldn't name but couldn't dismiss. Slowly, carefully, as if he were handling the most delicate crystal, the massive dragon lowered his great head until his snout was level with the child. "How can you see such things, small human?" he asked quietly. "How can you look upon a destroyer of worlds and speak of sadness rather than death?" Maya reached out with both hands now, her tiny fingers barely spanning the width of a single scale on the dragon's snout. To everyone's amazement, Vorthak didn't pull away. He held perfectly still as the child's warm hands touched his ancient scales, her skin barely registering against his armored hide. "My dad taught me," Maya said simply. "He said that sometimes when animals act really mean and scary, it's because they're hurt or scared themselves." He said the meanest dog in our town used to be really nice, but then bad people hurt him, and now he thinks everyone wants to hurt him too."
The comparison should have been insulting, comparing the mighty Vorthak to a damaged domestic animal.
Yet somehow, coming from the child's innocent lips, it felt more like understanding than insult. The dragon found himself remembering things he had buried for centuries, memories from before the Empire, before the conquest, before the endless cycle of fear and domination that had defined his existence. Around the plaza, the Zelani had begun to rise from their kneeling positions, their crystal forms flickering with patterns of confusion and cautious hope. Elder Crystallis, who had been prepared to die moments before, now stood transfixed as he watched the impossible scene unfolding before him. A seminar high above, Sarah's diplomatic ship had finally reached the surface, landing with emergency thrusters just outside the plaza. The ambassador raced from her vessel, her security detail behind her, but stopped short when she saw her daughter calmly petting the snout of the galaxy's most feared predator. "Maya," Sarah called out, her voice carefully controlled despite the terror clawing at her heart. "Sweetheart, please step away from there slowly." Maya looked over at her mother and waved cheerfully. "It's okay, Mom. He's not really scary. He's just pretending because he thinks he has to." The words struck Vorthak like lightning. Pretending because he thinks he has to. How had this human youngling seen through 10,000 years of carefully constructed terror in just a few moments? How had she recognized the performance that even he had forgotten was a performance? "The child speaks wisdom beyond her years," said a new voice, and all eyes turned to see another dragon approaching across the plaza. This one was smaller than Vorthak, but clearly ancient, her scales a deep blue-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Mistral the Whisperer, keeper of draconian lore and the closest thing their species had to a philosopher. "Mistral," Vorthak acknowledged, his voice still uncertain. "You should not be here. The ritual requires nothing but fear," Mistral interrupted, her own voice carrying centuries of weariness. "And this youngling has shown us something we had forgotten, that there are other ways to be strong." She approached Maya slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Unlike Vorthak's overwhelming presence, Mistral radiated a different kind of power, one based on knowledge and understanding rather than raw force. When she lowered her head to Maya's level, her eyes held a gentleness that surprised everyone present. "Hello, small wise one," Mistral said softly. "May I ask your name?" "I'm Maya," the child replied without hesitation, now reaching out to touch Mistral's scales as well. "What's your name? Are you Vorthak's friend?" The simple question sent ripples of shock through both Dragon and Zilani observers. Be friends. The concept was foreign to Draconian culture, where relationships were defined by dominance, submission, and useful alliances. Be. Yet as Mistral considered the question, she realized that her long association with Vortak was indeed the closest thing their species had to friendship. I am Mistral, she replied. And yes, I suppose I am his friend, though we have never used that word before. Maya beamed at this revelation. That's so nice. Everyone should have friends. It makes everything better. Vortak watched this exchange with growing bewilderment. The child's simple acceptance, her immediate assumption that dragons could be friends, that they could be good, it challenged everything he believed about himself and his kind. For the first time in centuries, he found himself questioning not just his methods, but his entire understanding of what it meant to be draconian. Great Vortak. Scareth's voice cut through the moment, sharp with disapproval. But this delay serves no purpose. The prey grows bold with your hesitation. Third, end this charade and complete the conquest. Several of the younger dragons voiced agreement, their growls rumbling across the plaza like distant thunder. They had come here expecting the familiar ritual of domination and fear, not this strange interaction with a human youngling who seemed to see dragons as potential pets rather than conquerors. But as the descent grew louder, something unexpected happened. Maya stepped closer to Vortak, positioning herself between the great dragon and his critics, her small body radiating protective defiance. Don't be mean to him, she said firmly, her child's voice carrying surprising authority. He's trying to figure out how to be better, and that's really hard work. You should help him instead of making it harder. The audacity of it. A 7-year-old human defending the most feared predator in the galaxy from his own subordinates stunned everyone into silence. But what was even more remarkable was Vorthak's reaction. Instead of being insulted by the child's protection, he found himself deeply moved by it. When did anyone last defend you, old friend? Mistral asked quietly, voicing the thought that was written in Vorthak's golden eyes. The answer was never. In all his long life, no one had ever stood up for him, ever suggested that he deserved kindness or understanding. He had been feared, obeyed, respected for his power, but never protected, never cared for simply because he existed. Maya looked up at him with those bright green eyes and asked the question that would change everything. Do you want to try being nice instead? It feels much better than being scary all the time. This for a long moment, his massive form still as stone. Around them, the plaza held its breath. Dragons, Zilani, and humans alike waited to see whether 10,000 years of galactic terror would end with a child's simple invitation to kindness. Finally, Vorthak spoke, his voice so quiet that everyone had to strain to hear him. I have forgotten how to be anything but what I am, small Maya. The Empire expects strength. My people expect conquest. The galaxy expects terror. But what do you expect? Maya asked. What do you want for yourself? The question hit Vorthak like a meteor. What did he want? When had anyone ever asked him that? Bration. When had he last asked himself? For millennia, he had simply been what others needed him to be. Weapon, conqueror, symbol of draconian might. But underneath all of that, what did Vortak himself actually want? The answer, when it came to him, was almost too simple to believe. Peace, he whispered, the word barely audible. I want peace. Maya smiled, her entire face lighting up with joy. Then let's have peace. It's easy. You just decide to be nice, and then you are. If only it were that simple, Vorthak thought. But even as he considered all the obstacles, the Empire's expectations, the other dragons' reactions, the complex web of fear and power that held their civilization together, he realized that Maya might be more right than wrong. Perhaps peace really was just a choice, one he had never allowed himself to make. Youngling speaks truth, Mistral said, her ancient voice carrying across the plaza. We have forgotten that strength can be found in mercy, that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the choice not to. Scareth reared back, his crimson scales flaring with anger. Blasphemy! The draconian way is conquest. We are predators, not whatever this soft talk suggests. Other dragons began to voice agreement, their roars building into a chorus of dissent. The plaza trembled under the force of their displeasure, and for a moment it seemed as though the moment of peace would shatter under the weight of tradition and expectation. But then Maya did something that no one expected. Protocol for crossing the places. She walked straight toward the most aggressive of the dragons, her small form crossing the plaza with determined steps. Scareth lowered his head to glare at the approaching child, his eyes burning with predatory fire. "You think you can change us, little human?" he snarled. "You think your soft words can turn dragons into pets?" Maya stopped directly in front of the angry dragon, close enough that his breath ruffled her hair. She looked up at him without fear, her expression thoughtful rather than defiant. "You're really scared, aren't you?" she said gently. "You're scared that if you're not mean and scary, no one will think you're important anymore." Scareth recoiled as if struck, his aggressive posture faltering. "I fear nothing. I am Scareth the Bold, breaker of fleets, scourge of the Outer Rim." "I know," Maya said sympathetically. "You've worked really hard to be scary and strong. But being nice is actually much harder than being mean, so if you learned how to do that, you'd be even stronger than you are now." The logic was so simple, so purely innocent, that it cut through centuries of conditioning like a blade through silk. Scareth stared down at the child, his anger slowly giving way to confusion, then to something that might have been vulnerability. I do not know how to be anything else," he admitted, his voice much smaller than before. Maya reached up toward him, just as she had with Vorthak. "That's okay. Nobody knows how to do new things at first. But you can learn. I can teach you if you want." As Scareth lowered his head to allow the child to touch his scales, something extraordinary began to happen throughout the plaza. Other dragons, watching their fierce lieutenants submit to a human youngling's gentle touch, began to question their own assumptions about strength and power. Elder Crystallis, speaking for the first time since Maya's arrival, stepped forward with cautious hope. "If this is truly a new path for your people," he said to Vorthak, "then perhaps there need be no conquest today. Perhaps we can find another way forward." Vorthak looked around the plaza, at Maya still comforting Scareth, at Mistral nodding with ancient approval, at the Zalani who were no longer cowering in terror, but standing with careful dignity. For the first time in millennia, he saw a future that didn't involve fear and domination. "The Empire will not understand," he said slowly. "Other dragon lords will see this as weakness. There will be those who challenge what has happened here today." Sarah, who had been watching the entire scene with a mixture of terror and amazement, finally found her voice. "Then maybe it's time for a new kind of empire," she said. "One built on understanding instead of fear." Maya looked up from where she was still petting Scareth's snout and nodded enthusiastically. "Yes, we could all be friends and help each other instead of hurting each other. Wouldn't that be much more fun?" The child's enthusiastic optimism was infectious, spreading through the plaza like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Dragons who had never considered any existence beyond conquest began to imagine what cooperation might look like. Zalani, who had expected to die, began to hope for something better than mere survival. But even as hope bloomed in the plaza, danger was approaching from the void of space. Other draconian fleets, hearing of the delay in conquest, were already moving towards Zalani Prime. The transformation beginning here would not go unchallenged, and Maya's simple act of kindness was about to trigger the greatest upheaval in galactic history. Opportune. As if sensing the approaching storm, Vorthak raised his great head and gazed toward the stars. "Change has begun," he said quietly. "But change is never easy, and there are those who will fight to preserve the old ways." Maya took his massive claw in both her tiny hands. "That's okay," she said with the unshakable confidence of childhood. "Good things are worth fighting for. And now you don't have to fight alone anymore." They bear for security present. A hope for a future he could actually want to live in. The path ahead would be difficult, perhaps impossible, but for the first time in 10,000 years. It was a path worth walking. The revolution had begun with a child's simple act of kindness. Where it would lead, none of them could say, but they would face it together. The first challenge to Vorthak's unprecedented decision came within hours, arriving in the form of 3 additional draconian fleets that had been monitoring the conquest from distant observation points. Their commander, Supreme Talon Draketh the Eternal, was known throughout the Empire for his absolute adherence to traditional ways and his complete intolerance for anything he perceived as weakness. The Maya had been moved to the relative safety of the Zalani council chambers, where she sat cross-legged on a crystal chair that had been hastily resized for her small frame. Around her, diplomats from 3 species tried to process the implications of what had occurred in the plaza, while outside, dragons and Zalani worked together for the first time in either species' history to prepare for the coming confrontation. "The child has triggered something extraordinary," Elder Crystallis observed, his translucent form shimmering with patterns of cautious optimism. "But Supreme Talon Draketh will not accept this deviation from Empire doctrine. He has destroyed entire worlds for lesser infractions." Ambassador Sarah Chen sat beside her daughter, still struggling to believe that Maya's simple act of compassion had somehow prevented a genocide and potentially started a civil war. The weight of galactic politics pressed down on her, made heavier by the knowledge that her 7-year-old daughter was now at the center of it all. "What exactly are we dealing with here?" Sarah asked Mistral, who had taken on the role of liaison between the species. "How much of the Empire will support what Vorthak has done?" The ancient dragon considered the question carefully, her blue-black scales rippling with thought patterns. "The Empire has existed for 10 millennia based on the principle of absolute dominance. Fear is not just our method, it is our identity. What happened in the plaza today challenges everything we believe about ourselves. But some dragons agreed with Vorthak," Maya pointed out, swinging her legs from the oversized chair. "Scareth was really nice once he stopped being scared. And you were nice from the beginning." Mistral's eyes softened as she regarded the child. "Yes, little one. Some of us have grown weary of the endless cycle of conquest and destruction, but we are few, and those who oppose us are many and powerful." As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the city. Through the crystal walls of the council chamber, they could see massive shadows passing overhead as Draketh's fleets entered the atmosphere. These ships were different from Vorthak's forces, larger, more aggressive in their design, bearing the scars and trophies of 1,000 successful conquests. Vorthak's voice reached them through the communication systems, his tone heavy with resignation and determination. "All forces prepare for confrontation. Ian. Draketh has arrived to restore Imperial discipline." The largest of the approaching vessels transformed as it descended, revealing itself to be a dragon, even more massive than Vorthak. Draketh's scales were deep obsidian shot through with veins of molten gold, and his eyes burned with the fire of uncounted destroyed worlds. When he landed in the plaza where Maya had first touched Vorthak, the crystal pavement cracked under his weight. "Vorthak the Render," Draketh's voice boomed across the city, amplified by technology that ensured every being on the planet could hear him. "You have violated the most sacred laws of our empire. You have shown weakness before prey. You have allowed inferior species to witness draconian hesitation. Explain yourself." Vorthak emerged from the city's administrative district, his own massive form moving with careful dignity. Behind him came several of his lieutenants, including Scareth, whose crimson scales now seemed less aggressive and more thoughtful than before. "I have shown wisdom, Draketh," Vorthak replied, his voice carrying across the plaza. "I have learned that there is strength in choices beyond destruction." Draketh's golden eyes blazed with fury. "Blasphemy. You speak the language of the weak. The Empire demands conquest, not philosophy." From the council chambers, Maya watched the confrontation unfold on the viewing screens that Mistral had activated. The tension in the plaza was thick enough to see 2 dragons who represented opposing philosophies of power, surrounded by followers who would have to choose between 10,000 years of tradition and the possibility of something better. "He's really angry," Maya observed, studying Draketh's aggressive posture. "But I think he's scared too, just like Scareth was." "Scared?" Sarah asked. "Sweetheart, that dragon has destroyed more civilizations than we have names for. What could he possibly be scared of?" Maya considered this with the serious expression she reserved for her most important thoughts. "He's scared that if dragons aren't the scariest thing in the galaxy anymore, then maybe they're not special. See, he doesn't know how to be important without being mean." The child's insight was so accurate that it took the adult's breath away. Mistral nodded slowly, her ancient eyes reflecting centuries of understanding. The youngling sees clearly, but Draketh has built his entire identity around being feared. Without that fear, he would have to discover who he really is, and that terrifies him more than any external threat. In the plaza, the confrontation was escalating. Draketh had begun to pace around Vorthak in the ritual pattern that preceded formal combat challenges, his massive wings casting moving shadows across the assembled crowd. "You will submit to imperial judgment," Draketh declared. "You will complete the conquest of this world as ordered, and you will execute the human youngling who has corrupted your purpose. Only then will your failure be forgiven." The demand to execute Maya sent shockwaves through both Dragon and Zalani observers. Well, several of Vorthak's supporters roared their objections, while the Zalani flickered with patterns of renewed terror. But Maya herself simply stood up from her crystal chair and walked toward the chamber's exit. "Maya, no." Sarah lunged after her daughter, but the child was already through the doorway and heading for the plaza. "She cannot face Draketh," Mistral said urgently, her massive form turning to follow. "He is not like Vorthak or the others. His heart has been closed to compassion for millennia. The youngling's gift may not reach him." But Maya was already running across the plaza, her small form weaving between the massive legs of dragons and the crystalline bodies of Zalani. She reached the center of the confrontation just as Draketh was preparing to strike Vorthak with claws that could shear through starship hulls. "Stop," Maya called out, her child's voice somehow cutting through the rumble of draconic anger. Stop being mean to each other." Draketh's head snapped toward her, his molten eyes fixing on the tiny human who dared interrupt an imperial judgment. For a moment the plaza held its breath, waiting to see whether the Supreme Talon would kill the child where she stood or merely incinerate her as an afterthought. Instead, something unexpected happened. Draketh began to laugh, a sound like avalanches and volcanic eruptions, terrible and cold and completely without humor. "So this is the great corruptor," he said, lowering his massive head until he was eye level with Maya. "This tiny scrap of flesh that has turned the mighty Vorthak into a philosopher. Tell me, little human, do you think your magic words will work on me as well?" Maya looked up at him without flinching, though the heat radiating from his scales made her squint. "I don't have magic words," she said honestly. "I just have true words. And the true words are that you're really, really sad and lonely, and you think being scary is the only way to make the sadness stop." Rocket's laughter died instantly. His golden eyes narrowed to slits as he studied the child who had just described his innermost pain with casual accuracy. "You know nothing of what I am, youngling. I am Supreme Talon of the Draconian Empire. I am the flame that burns beyond stars. I have reduced entire civilizations to ash in memory." "I know," Maya said gently, "but that didn't make you happy, did it? It just made you more sad and more lonely. Because every time you hurt someone, it hurt you too. That's why you keep having to hurt more and more people. Because the sadness keeps growing instead of going away." Dakari, the accuracy of her observation struck Draketh like a physical blow. He reared back, his massive form trembling with something that might have been rage or might have been recognition. "Silence," he roared, flames beginning to gather in his throat. "I will not be analyzed by prey." But Maya didn't back down. Instead, she took a step closer to the enraged dragon, her small hand extended in the same gesture of friendship she had offered to Vorthak and Scareth.
"It's okay," she said softly.
"You don't have to be scared anymore. You don't have to be lonely anymore. Paper, we can all be friends, and friends help each other feel better." The offer hung in the air like a bridge spanning an impossible chasm. Around the plaza, dragons and Zalani alike watched in silence as the child waited for Draketh's response. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. For a moment, just one brief, shining moment, something flickered in Draketh's golden eyes. Something that might have been hope, might have been longing for the peace that Maya offered so freely. But then his conditioning reasserted itself. 10,000 years of imperial indoctrination crushing the moment of vulnerability like a boot on a flower. "Enough," he said, his voice cold as the void between stars. "I have heard enough heresy. The child dies. The traitors die, the empire continues." Draketh opened his massive jaws, revealing the fires of stellar destruction building in his throat. The heat washed over the plaza in waves, crystal buildings beginning to glow from the radiated energy. But before he could release the killing flame, Vorthak struck. The ancient dragon launched himself across the plaza with desperate speed, positioning himself between Draketh and Maya just as the Supreme Talon released his attack. An energy that should have incinerated the child instead struck Vorthak full in the chest, sending him tumbling across the crystal pavement. "No!" Maya screamed, running toward the fallen dragon despite the danger. Around the plaza, chaos erupted as dragons chose sides and began to fight, some supporting Draketh's authority while others rallied to defend Vorthak's new path. Maya reached Vorthak's side just as Mistral and several other dragons formed a protective circle around them. The great dragon's scales were blackened and cracked from Draketh's attack, golden blood seeping between the damaged plates. "Why did you do that?" Maya asked, tears streaming down her face as she pressed her tiny hands against his wounds. "Why did you get hurt for me?" Vorthak's eyes focused on her with effort, his breathing labored but steady. Because, he said softly, his voice barely audible over the sounds of battle raging around them, "that is what friends do for each other." The simple declaration sent ripples of shock through every dragon who heard it. Friendship, the concept that Maya had introduced to their species just hours before, had motivated their greatest warrior to sacrifice himself for a human child. The impossible had become real, and even in the midst of battle, its significance was not lost. "Touching," Draketh snarled, approaching through the chaos of fighting dragons. The great Vorthak discovers sentiment just in time to die from it. How poetic. But as he prepared to deliver the finishing blow, something unexpected happened. Scareth, who had been struggling with his own loyalties throughout the confrontation, suddenly interposed himself between Draketh and the wounded Vorthak.
"Stand down, Supreme Talon," Scareth said, his voice steady despite the trembling in his wings.
"I challenge your authority." The words sent a shock through the entire plaza. Challenging the Supreme Talon was tantamount to suicide. No dragon had successfully opposed Imperial authority in over 3 millennia. Daket's eyes blazed with fury. "You dare? You who have learned weakness from a human child." "I have learned strength," Scareth replied, his crimson scales beginning to glow with inner fire. "The strength to choose compassion over conquest, understanding over domination. The strength to protect rather than destroy." Around them, the battle began to shift as more dragons heard Scareth's declaration. Some roared approval, while others recoiled in horror. The civil war that had been brewing since Maya's first act of kindness was now erupting into open conflict. But Maya, still kneeling beside the wounded Vorthak, was thinking beyond the immediate battle. Her 7-year-old mind, unencumbered by the complexities of politics and tradition, had grasped something that the adults had missed. "This is all wrong," she said, loud enough for both factions to hear her. "You're fighting about whether to be nice or mean, but fighting isn't nice at all. If you really want to be better, you have to stop hurting each other." Her words cut through the din of battle like a bell through thunder. Dragons on both sides paused in their combat, suddenly aware of the contradiction in their actions. How could they claim to represent either compassion or strength while tearing each other apart? Draketh seized on the moment of confusion to launch himself toward Maya, claws extended to end her influence once and for all. But this time, he didn't face a single defender. Vorthak, wounded but not defeated, rose to meet him. Scareth flanked from the left, while Mistral approached from the right. Behind them came a dozen other dragons who had chosen Maya's path of compassion, their combined presence creating a wall of protective determination. "You face us all now, Draketh," Vorthak said, his voice gaining strength. "All who have chosen to grow beyond what we were." For the first time in millennia, Draketh found himself outnumbered by opponents who fought not from fear or ambition, but from love. The realization struck him like lightning. This was what he had truly feared all along. Not weakness, but the strength that came from caring about something beyond himself. As the two forces faced each other across the plaza, with Maya standing small but unafraid at the center of it all, the future of the Draconian Empire hung in the balance. A child who had started it all with a simple act of kindness now watched as an entire civilization struggled to decide what it wanted to become. The battle was far from over, but something fundamental had already changed. Maya had planted a seed of compassion in the hearts of creatures who had known only conquest, and now that seed was growing into something that could reshape the galaxy itself. Whether it would survive the forces arrayed against it remained to be seen, but one thing was certain: the universe would never be the same again. The standoff in the plaza stretched through the long Zilani day, with neither side willing to make the first move toward renewed violence. Maya had positioned herself between the two dragon factions, her small presence somehow creating a buffer zone that neither Draketh nor Vorthak's forces were willing to cross. As the twin suns began to set, casting long shadows across the Crystal City, reinforcements arrived from across the galaxy. The news of what was happening on Zilani Prime had spread through both the Draconian Empire and the galactic community with unprecedented speed. What had begun as a single child's act of compassion was now threatening to tear apart the established order of known space. Ambassador Sarah Chen found herself at the center of negotiations she had never been trained for, working with Elder Crystallis and Mistral to establish some kind of framework for peaceful resolution. Irony wasn't lost on her that humanity's first major diplomatic crisis in this sector involved her 7-year-old daughter as the primary catalyst. The Empire cannot survive this division, Mistral explained as they huddled in the council chambers while dragons circled overhead like living storm clouds. Our entire civilization is built on unity of purpose. If we fragment now, it will mean civil war across 100 worlds. Then maybe the Empire shouldn't survive, Sarah said quietly, watching Maya through the crystal walls as the child sat peacefully between the two dragon factions, irradiating their disagreement with the same patient attention she gave to playground disputes back home. Maybe it's time for something better. Elder Crystallis's crystal form shimmered with complex patterns of thought. The ambassador raises a profound point. Perhaps the question is not how to preserve the old order, but how to build a new one that serves all our peoples better. Outside in the plaza, Maya had begun what could only be described as story time. Dragons from both factions had gradually moved closer to hear her clear child's voice as she told them about her home world, about humans learning to live alongside creatures that other species feared, about the importance of understanding rather than fighting. Back home, we have these really big birds called terrorhawks, Maya was explaining, to a mixed group of dragons that included both Vorthak's supporters and several of Draketh's more moderate followers. They're bigger than our houses and they have claws that could cut through metal. Everyone was scared of them at first. Draketh himself had moved within listening range, though he maintained the pretense of monitoring his followers rather than paying attention to the child's words. His golden eyes remained fixed on Maya as she continued her tale. But then my dad noticed that the Terrorhawks only attacked when people got too close to their nests. They weren't being mean. They were being parents protecting their babies. So we learned to leave the nesting areas alone, and the Terrorhawks learned that we weren't trying to hurt their families. Now they even help us sometimes, warning us about dangerous storms and stuff. Scareth, who had become something of Maya's unofficial guardian among the dragons, nodded thoughtfully. The youngling suggests that understanding motive can transform enemies into allies. It's not about enemies and allies, Maya corrected gently. It's about everybody just wanting to be safe and happy and loved. The Terrorhawks wanted their babies to be safe. People wanted to not get hurt. When we understood that, we could all have what we wanted. A younger dragon from Draketh's faction, one whose scales showed the bright silver of recent maturity, spoke up hesitantly. But what if someone wants things that hurt other people? What if they want to conquer and destroy? Maya considered this with the same serious expression she brought to all difficult questions. I think maybe people want to conquer things when they're scared that if they don't control everything, something bad will happen to them. Like, maybe they think that if they're not the strongest, someone else will hurt them. Parking standard. The insight struck home with painful accuracy. Around the listening circle, dragons shifted uncomfortably as they recognized their own motivations in the child's simple analysis. But that's not really true, Maya continued. Being the strongest and scariest doesn't make you safe. It just makes everyone else scared of you, and scared people do desperate things. You're safer when people like you and want to help you than when they're terrified of you. Draketh could remain silent no longer. He moved fully into the circle, his massive presence causing several dragons to step back nervously. But Maya simply looked up at him with the same patient attention she gave to everyone else. "You speak of safety, youngling," Draketh rumbled, his voice carefully controlled. "But you have lived only 7 years in a protected environment. What do you know of the true dangers of the galaxy? Of species that would destroy others without provocation? Of the necessity of strength to survive in a hostile universe?" Maya nodded solemnly. "You're right. I haven't seen lots of scary things yet, but I've seen scared things. And scared things are what become scary things. Like bullies at school are usually kids who are getting hurt at home. They're mean because they're sad and scared, not because they're just bad." She stood up and walked directly to Draketh, stopping just within reach of his massive claws. "I think maybe dragons became scary because someone hurt them a really long time ago, and they've been scared and sad ever since, but they forgot how to ask for help." The plaza fell silent except for the whisper of wind through crystal spires. Draketh stared down at the tiny human who had just laid bare the deepest wound of his species with casual accuracy. "You presume much, child," he said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier fury. "I presume that everyone deserves to be happy," Maya replied simply. "Even scary people, even people who've done bad things. Everyone deserves a chance to learn how to be better." As if her words were a key turning in an ancient lock, something shifted in Draketh's expression. The rigid mask of imperial authority cracked slightly, revealing a glimpse of the pain and loneliness that Mistral had carried for millennia. "And if we cannot learn," he asked quietly, "if we are too old, too set in our ways, too damaged by what we have done." Maya smiled, the expression lighting up her entire face. "Then we help you learn. That's what friends do. They help each other get better at being good." The simple offer of help, made without condition or judgment, broke something inside the ancient dragon that 10,000 years of warfare had not been able to touch. For the first time since his youth, Draketh felt tears gathering in his golden eyes. "I have done terrible things," he whispered, his voice so quiet that only those closest to him could hear. "I have silenced the songs of worlds. I have turned civilizations to ash and memory. How can there be redemption for such crimes?" Maya walked even closer until she was standing directly beneath the great dragon's head. She reached up with both hands, and after a moment's hesitation, Draketh lowered himself until she could touch his scales. "You can't undo the bad things," she said softly, her child's hands gentle against his ancient armor. "But you can stop doing new bad things, and you can start doing good things instead. That's how you get better. One good choice at a time." The transformation was visible across Draketh's massive form. Scales that had been rigid with tension began to relax. The aggressive set of his wings softened, and the fire in his eyes shifted from destructive rage to something warmer and more complex. Around the plaza, dragons from both factions watched in amazement as their supreme talon, the embodiment of imperial authority and the most feared predator in known space, wept openly while a human child offered him forgiveness he had never dared to hope for. "I do not know how to be anything but what I am," Draketh said, his voice thick with tears. "Then we'll learn together," Vorthak said, stepping forward despite his injuries. "All of us. We'll learn how to be something new." Mistral moved to join them, her ancient wisdom adding weight to the moment. The Empire can become something better than it was, not through destruction but through growth. Not through fear, but through understanding. As more dragons from both factions gathered around the unlikely scene of reconciliation, word began to spread beyond the plaza. Across Zalani Prime, throughout the Draconian fleets in orbit, and eventually across the galactic communication networks, the impossible news traveled. The most feared predators in known space were learning compassion from a 7-year-old human. But even as hope bloomed in the plaza, danger was gathering in the void beyond the planet's atmosphere. Not all of the Empire would accept this transformation, and already, the most conservative factions were mobilizing to crush what they saw as an existential threat to their way of life. Admiral Korath, the Desolate, second only to Draketh in Imperial hierarchy, had been monitoring the situation from his flagship at the edge of the system. Unlike Draketh, Korath felt no internal conflict about the Empire's methods. He was a true believer in Draconian supremacy and he would not allow a human child to destroy everything their civilization had built. "Prepare the extinction protocol," he commanded his subordinates, his voice cold with absolute certainty. "If Dracoth has been compromised, then it falls to us to preserve the Empire's integrity." The extinction protocol was the Empire's ultimate weapon, a coordinated attack that would sterilize an entire world in minutes, leaving nothing behind but molten rock and the message that resistance to draconian rule was futile. It had been used only 3 times in Imperial history, reserved for threats so severe that they required complete annihilation rather than mere conquest. On the planet below, Maya was teaching dragons how to play simple human games, her laughter mixing with the deep rumbles of draconic amusement as ancient predators struggled with concepts like taking turns and being fair. It was a scene of such innocent joy that it would have been heartwarming under other circumstances. But Mistral, ever sensitive to the currents of Imperial politics, suddenly raised her head toward the stars. Her enhanced senses had detected the subtle changes in energy patterns that preceded orbital bombardment. "All forces, emergency scatter pattern," she roared, her voice carrying across the planet. "Extinction protocol incoming." The peaceful scene in the plaza shattered as dragons took flight in all directions, some carrying Zalani civilians to safety while others raced toward orbit to confront the incoming threat. But they all knew it was too late. The extinction protocol, once initiated, was virtually unstoppable. Maya, confused by the sudden chaos, stood alone in the center of the plaza as dragons and Zalani fled in all directions. She looked up at the darkening sky, where new stars were beginning to appear, the weapon platforms preparing to reduce her world to ash. "What's happening?" she called out, her small voice lost in the noise of evacuation. Vorthak, despite his injuries, swept down to scoop the child up in his protective claws. "We must leave, little friend. The sky itself has become our enemy." But as they prepared to flee, Maya looked back at the beautiful crystal city that had been her first glimpse of truly alien civilization. She thought of Elder Crystallis and all the gentle Zalani who had shown her such kindness. She thought of the progress they had made, the dragons who had learned to choose compassion over conquest. "No," she said firmly. "We're not running away. We're going to stop them." Vorthak's golden eyes widened with alarm. "Child, this is not a battle that can be won through compassion. Korath commands weapons that can crack planets. Your gift cannot reach him from here." Maya looked up at the ancient dragon who had become her friend, her green eyes bright with determination. "Maybe my gift can't reach him," she said. "But maybe our gift can. All of us together, dragons and Zalani and humans, all choosing to be good at the same time, maybe that's strong enough to change anything." As orbital bombardment platforms began to charge their world-killing weapons high above, a 7-year-old girl prepared to stake everything on the power of unified compassion. The greatest test of her simple philosophy was about to begin, and the fate of entire civilizations hung on whether love could truly conquer all. High above Zalani Prime, Admiral Karath the Desolate stood aboard his massive command vessel, watching the final preparations for planetary sterilization. His scales were the deep black of the void between stars, unmarked by the golden veins that showed wisdom or the silver traces that indicated compassion. He was, by his own choice, a creature of pure purpose, the preservation of draconian supremacy at any cost. "All platforms report ready, Admiral," his second-in-command reported. "We await your order to commence the extinction protocol." Korath's eyes, cold as distant stars, surveyed the planet below. Prevented. Somewhere down there, a human child had managed to corrupt the very foundations of Imperial thought. The infection had spread to include even Supreme Talon Dracoth, transforming the Empire's greatest warrior into something weak and sentimental. "The Empire has endured for 10 millennia," Korath said to himself, as much as to his crew. "It will not fall to the misguided mercy of a single human youngling." But even as he prepared to give the order, something unprecedented began to happen in the space around Zalani Prime. Dragons were approaching, not in the aggressive formations typical of Imperial fleets, but in loose, almost peaceful groupings that included both Vorthak's supporters and many of Dracoth's former followers. More surprising still, they weren't alone. Zalani craft had emerged from the planet's surface, their crystal hulls gleaming like jewels against the void, and streaming in from the outer system came human vessels. Not just Sarah's diplomatic ship, but an entire fleet that had been rushing towards Zalani Prime since news of the crisis had reached Earth. Admiral, his tactical officer reported with confusion in his voice, the approaching forces are not deploying for combat. They're forming some kind of circle around the planet. Korath moved to the observation deck, his massive form radiating displeasure. Through the transparent barriers, he could see the impossible sight taking shape around Zalani Prime. Dragons, humans, and Zalani were positioning themselves between the planet and his weapon platforms, creating a living shield of three species united in common purpose. Protocol through sacrifice, Korath mused. How, primitive, begin charging sequence. Their gesture will be noted before they are incinerated along with their world. But as the weapon platforms began to build energy for planetary annihilation, something even more unprecedented occurred. The mixed fleet around Zalani Prime began to broadcast not military communications or surrender negotiations, but something that had never been transmitted across interstellar space before. This started as a single voice, Maya's clear young tones carrying across the void through every communication channel simultaneously. "Hello up there," she said, her words somehow reaching every ship in Korath's fleet. "I know you're scared and angry, but we want to be your friends too." Korath's claws scraped against the deck plating. "Silence that transmission immediately." But his communications officer's hands hesitated over the controls. "Admiral, it's not coming through our normal channels. It's everywhere. Every frequency. Every system." Maya's voice continued, joined now by other voices. Zalani singing in their crystalline harmonies, humans speaking in dozens of languages, and most shocking of all, dragons adding their deep rumbles to the growing chorus. "We know you think you have to hurt us to stay safe," Maya's voice carried clearly above the growing symphony. "But we've learned something really important down here. When everyone chooses to be kind at the same time, it makes a power that's stronger than any weapon." Across Korath's fleet, something extraordinary was happening. The dragon crews who had served the Empire with unquestioning loyalty for centuries were beginning to listen, really listen, to the child's words. The message was spreading through their ships like wildfire, carried not just by communication systems but by something deeper, the recognition of truth. On the planet's surface, the transformation Maya had described was becoming visible reality. In the Crystal Plaza where everything had begun, dragons and Zalani worked side by side to coordinate the defense effort. Vorthak, his wounds bandaged with crystal fiber that gleamed like captured starlight, stood alongside Elder Crystallis as they directed the unprecedented cooperation between their species. Draketh, meanwhile, had taken upon himself the task of reaching out to the Imperial forces above. His voice joined Maya's broadcast, carrying the authority of his rank but none of its traditional menace. "I am Supreme Talon Draketh," he announced, his words reaching every dragon in Korath's fleet. "A pending of strength through domination. But I have learned from a human youngling that there is a greater strength, the courage to choose compassion over conquest." The effect on the Imperial fleet was immediate and chaotic. Some dragons roared their approval, while others recoiled in horror at what they perceived as ultimate betrayal. Ships began to break formation as crews struggled with the implications of their Supreme Commander's transformation. Korath watched his carefully ordered fleet dissolve into confusion and felt something he had rarely experienced in his long life: desperation. The infection of compassion was spreading faster than he could contain it, threatening to destroy everything he had dedicated his existence to preserving. "Ignore the transmissions," he commanded his remaining loyal crews. "Focus on duty. Focus on the Empire." 3. Begin bombardment. Now. The weapon platforms began to discharge, sending streams of destructive energy toward the planet below. But something impossible happened. The combined fleet of dragons, humans, and Zalani moved to intercept the beams, their ships taking hits that should have destroyed them instantly. Instead, the defensive formation held. Ships that should have been vaporized merely sustained damage, their crews working frantically to maintain position between the weapons and the world they were protecting. It was as if their collective will to protect was somehow making them stronger than physics should have allowed. Maya's voice came through the chaos, still clear and unafraid despite the destruction raining down around her defenders. "It's working," she announced with the excitement of a child who had just discovered something wonderful. "When we all care about each other at the same time, we really can do anything." On Korath's command ship, his crew was beginning to desert their posts. Dragon after dragon was leaving their stations, some openly weeping as they realized what they had been participating in. The careful hierarchy that had held the Imperial fleet together was crumbling under the weight of a single child's absolute faith in the power of kindness. "Admiral," his communications officer said, his voice thick with emotion, "I cannot continue this bombardment. The youngling speaks truth. We have become the very thing we claim to protect the galaxy from." Korath struck the deserting dragon with claws that could shear through battle armor, but instead of falling, his subordinates simply looked at him with pity. "You are in pain, Admiral," the communications officer said gently. "You have been in pain for so long that you no longer remember what it feels like to be happy. But it is not too late. It is never too late to choose differently." Around the command bridge, the remaining crew members were nodding in agreement. Even his most loyal followers were beginning to see the futility of trying to preserve an empire built on fear, when faced with the simple, undeniable power of unified compassion. Korath found himself alone on his bridge, the weapon system slowly powering down as his crews abandoned their posts. Through the observation windows, he could see the defensive formation around Zelani Prime holding strong, ships from 3 species working together to protect a world that just days ago had been scheduled for conquest. And through it all, Maya's voice continued to broadcast, now joined by thousands of others in what had become a galactic chorus of hope. "We forgive you," the child said, her words somehow directed personally at every dragon in the Imperial fleet. "We forgive all the scary things you did because you were scared, and we want to help you learn how to be happy instead of mean." The offer of forgiveness, freely given without conditions or demands for surrender, broke the last of Korath's resistance. The ancient dragon who had dedicated his existence to preserving Imperial supremacy through force realized that he was facing something against which all his weapons were useless: unconditional love. Slowly, carefully, Korath activated his personal communicator. "This is Admiral Korath," he announced, his voice carrying across the fleet. I surrender, not to superior force, but to superior wisdom. Stand down all weapons. The extinction protocol is canceled." The cheer that arose from the combined fleet around Zelani Prime could be heard across multiple star systems. On the planet's surface, dragons and Zelani embraced in celebration, while humans wept with relief that their crazy gambit had actually worked. Maya, still broadcasting from the Crystal Plaza, clapped her hands with delight. "See? I told you it would work. When everyone chooses to be good together, there's nothing that can't get better." In the days that followed, the transformation of the Draconian Empire sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy. Worlds that had lived in terror of dragon fleets suddenly found themselves dealing with diplomatic delegations offering trade agreements and cultural exchanges. Species that had never dared to challenge imperial authority discovered that the dragons were now genuinely interested in learning about other ways of life. The change wasn't universal or immediate. There were holdout factions that rejected the new philosophy, rogue dragons who continued to prey on the weak, and countless practical challenges involved in rebuilding an entire civilization's worldview. But the foundation had been laid for something unprecedented in galactic history: an empire based on cooperation rather than domination. Maya herself became something of a legend, though she remained remarkably unchanged by her galactic fame. When asked by reporters how she had known that her approach would work, she gave the same patient explanation she had offered from the beginning. "Everyone just wants to be safe and happy and loved. When you help people get what they really want, they want to help you too." It's not complicated. Grown-ups just sometimes forget how simple good things can be. Her words became the unofficial motto of what historians would later call the Compassion Revolution. Carved into crystal monuments on 100 worlds, translated into 1,000 languages, and taught to children throughout the galaxy, Maya's simple philosophy spread like seeds on fertile ground. The Draconian Empire evolved into the Draconian Commonwealth, with Vorthak and Dracaith serving as co-leaders of a new government based on consensus and mutual aid rather than fear and submission. Mistral became their chief diplomat, using her ancient wisdom to help other species understand the depth of the dragon's transformation. Korath, meanwhile, dedicated himself to what he called redemption through service. He used his military expertise to help defend worlds that had previously been Imperial targets, proving that former enemies could become the most dedicated protectors. As for Maya, she returned to her frontier world with her mother, where she continued to play with terror hawks and help resolve playground disputes with the same patient wisdom she had brought to galactic politics. But she kept in touch with her dragon friends, exchanging letters and visits that helped cement the bonds between species. Years later, when asked what had driven her to approach that first dragon in the plaza, Maya's answer remained characteristically simple. He looked like he needed a hug. It was, perhaps, the most profound diplomatic insight in galactic history, that sometimes the greatest victories come not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them remember how to be happy. The revolution that began with a child's act of kindness continued to spread, touching every corner of known space. And while challenges remained, they always do, the galaxy had learned something precious, that the choice to be good, made collectively and without reservation, really could change anything. Even the scariest dragons in the universe, it turned out, just needed someone to believe they could be better. And sometimes, that someone is a 7-year-old girl with green eyes and an unshakable faith in the power of